Now let's take a look at the Pyro first source. Pyro first source is used to create the explosion source. Let's see that. So in here, I'm going to create a geometry node in here, and let's dive inside. And in here, let's type Pyro. And here we have all of these nodes related to creating the Pyro simulation. And I'm going to in here add a Pyro first source. So let's type this and add this. And here we have the Pyro burst source, and let me enable my play bar, and in here we have some animation built in. Let me zoom out, and if I scrub my play bar, here you can see I have some animation. And essentially what that node will do, it will just create these bunch of points. So we are creating these points, we are creating these interesting shapes. These shapes will create an interesting source for our explosion. And whenever you want to create explosion, it's not a necessary thing or it's a must thing that you must need to add Pyro first source if you want to create explosion. It's nothing like that. It's just interesting source. If you want to create explosion using sphere, you can add a sphere in here, and after this sphere you can just scatter a bunch of points by using the Pyro source node. Let's add a Pyro source. I'm going to connect this, and you can play around with the particle separation, and we need to change this to surface or volume scatter for this parameter to have an effect. And down here you can just add the noises onto your attributes and build your VDB volume for sourcing and import them into your Pyro solver to create the explosion. You can completely do this, but this node, it will create these interesting shapes for our source. We have these bunch of points, and we can play around with the parameter to adjust these shapes or these points shapes. So in here I'm going to just remove this, and let's take a look at its parameter. And in here at the very first tab we have the shape tab and the first type, and right now we are using the explosion type preset. And I can also play around with my shape offset to create a shape that I like, and that way by using the shape offset we are basically adjusting the random seed. And I can play around with this random seed and go through the shapes that I like for my source. I'm going to let's change this to any value, and in here if I were to hit play, and we have some animation built in here, and I can control my initial size. If I want to create a bigger size source, I can just change this value, and that way I can create this initial size bigger or smaller. And by changing the initial size, we are starting with 3 units, and we should expand beyond this 3 unit. That is the shape size. I'm going to just change this to its default value. And down here we have the direction, at which direction I want these points to grow. I can change this to any direction. Let's change this to X, and maybe zero out the Y, and now we have these points growing in that direction. Let me change this to 1 again and zero this out. And in here I can play around with the spreading angle to create a more pointier shapes. And in here, as you can see, we are adjusting the spreading, and I can play around with the roundness. And if I were to change this to all the way up to 1, now it will try to keep all of these points inside of this conical shape. And if I were to play around with the spreading angle, and here as you can see we have this cone looking shape, and by adjusting the spread I can play around with the spreading, and by lowering down this roundness value I can just randomize the scale to create the random scale of these trailing. So maybe let's add some randomness by adding the roundness to break up this round conical shape. And down here we have the number of trailings, how many trails that we want to create. If I were to lower down the number of trailings, I am effectively creating less and less of these trails. And same thing, I can keep increasing this to add more and more of these trails. And down here we have the trailing separation, and by lowering down this value we will going to be creating more and more points. If I were to, let's say, lower down the number of trailings, and right now here as you can see we have these points, and these points are very sparse. We are creating very less points. I'm going to just lower down this trailing separation value. Let's change this to 0.01, and now here as you can see we are creating a lot more points. And same thing, let's just default this out by pressing and holding the control and middle mouse button. And in here we can adjust the trailing length, and that will control the length of our trails. And if I were to lower this value down, and here as you can see we have these shorter trails, and by increasing the trail length I can continue increasing this length, and I have this trailing thickness, and that will control the overall starting thickness. If I were to lower this value down, and maybe it will be easier to see if I were just to make more of these lower down this trailing separation to add more points. And if I were to adjust the trailing thickness, and here as you can see I am creating these lines. I am zeroing out its start radius, and in here I'm controlling its start radius to create this conical shape. And let's go in here. First we have this burst type. Right now we are using the explosion preset, and we have some presets built in. For example, if you want to create a muzzle flash, I can just add a muzzle flash type, and right now it's not looking like a muzzle flash. We need to default out all of these settings. So I'm going to just press and hold the control key, and I'm going to middle mouse button on all of these settings to 0 or default out all of these parameters. So now we are back at the defaults, and here we have this muzzle flash type, and here as you can see our source looks different, and I can change this to shockwave, and that will create this ground shockwave type source, which is good. And in here we can also change this to blastring. It will create these blastring that we will get when we are going to create a nuclear explosion. When nuclear explosion happen, we will get these blastring because of the high pressure. So you can create blastring by using this preset. I'm going to change this to explosion, or maybe let's change this to shockwave. And in here we have some other option. With the shockwave I can add a shape noise, and here as you can see we have some other parameter. When we have changed this to shockwave, now we have this azimuth start angle and azimuth angle, and if I were to lower down this angle, I'm effectively just cutting off this round shape. And which means if I were to grab my play bar, and here as you can see I am creating this shockwave in half of this angle, and I can continue playing around with this to create this shape like this. I'm going to just change this to all the way up to 360 because shockwave is circular, so let's keep this at circular. And to actually break this circular shape, we have this add shape noise. Let's enable this, and by doing so I can just add some noise amplitude, and let's lower down its size, that is the frequency of the noise. And here as you can see we are breaking up this round shape. Now we have some breakups, and breakups are always good. And I'm going to lower down its particle separation. Let's change this to 0.05 to better view all of these settings. And here we have the shape noise amplitude. You can do so. Let me disable this, and now let's go into the next tab, which is the burst animation tab. Let's go in here, and in here we can define the start frame, and I can change this to, let's say, I want the shockwave to start maybe, let's say, frame number. I'm going to change this to 15 maybe. And now if I were to go into my frame number 15, here as you can see, at the frame number 15, we are getting our animation. And that is the start frame. I'm going to just default out this to 1 because I want my animation to start at the very first frame. And here we have the frame duration, and that will control the overall frame length. And right now we have the animation at first 5 frame. And if I want to add more of our animation frame, I'm going to just increase this value. And by doing so, I am creating this slow-mo growing effect. I'm actually slowing down its overall speed by increasing the frame number. And let's continue increasing this. And let's hit rewind and hit play. And here as you can see. And right now this animation is playing as fast as it can. And to actually play this in real time, we need to enable this clock button, and that way we will going to be enable playing animation in real time. So let's hit play, and here you can see that is the real time animation. And I'm going to just lower this value down because we want this shock to start at very high speed. And in here we have the interior expansion that will control the interior, and it's right now harder to see, which means I need to go into this advanced frame. So let's go in here at the frame number 15, and now I can clearly see the effect, and that it controls the interior expansion. And same thing, I can play around with the exterior expansion. And if I were to lower this value down and maybe increase this value, and that way I can just create a growing circular effect, create a growing circle. Let me play around with this. And here we have the directional translation. What that will do, it will just move your offset over this blast ring. And if I were to adjust this value, and here you can see this blast wave, this shock wave is moving at the Y. And if you want to lift your source up, you can do so by adjusting this directional translation. And now let's go into the burst component. And here as you can see, if I were to zoom in, and we have this weird visualization of these points. And in here we are getting some of the points. We have white points, and we have yellow points, and we have some blue points. So what are these? These are the attributes that we are creating. This Pyro first source is adding. And if I were to middle mouse button, and here as you can see, we have quite a few attributes. We have burn, we have density for smoke, and we are also creating the temperature and V for velocity. And these color are actually visualizing all of these attributes. And if I were to come into the burst components are the attribute that this node is adding. And in here as you can see, we are creating 3 attributes, and the number 1 is the density for creating the smoke, and the second we are creating the temperature, and the third we are creating our burn attribute. And if I were to remove this attribute, I can just click on this remove button, click on it, and I can click this again to remove this temperature attribute as well. Now we are only creating density attribute, and here as you can see, we have these visualizer attached to it. This Pyro first source will going to visualize all of these attributes. So density is always going to be visualized as a white particles, and I can change the attribute. So let's click on it, and if I were to create temperature, and here as you can see, the temperature is visualized in blue. And if I were to change this to divergence is in orange color. The divergence is used to add the expansion, and we will talk about divergence in the next lesson when we are going to create the explosion. For now, that is the divergence, and here we have the burn, and it is visualized in yellow particles. And if you want to create multiple of these attributes, I'm going to just make the first attribute to intensity. And to create another attribute, I just come over here where it says number of sources. I just need to click on it. And what that will do, it will add another attribute. And onto these sources, I can just enable create source. And now we are adding the intensity field, creating the intensity attribute. And in here, I'm going to just say add the temperature. And here as you can see, we have the temperature visualized in blue. And I can continue adding more of the attribute. Just click on this plus button and create source. And in here, let's also add the burn. And that is why we have this colorful visualization. It's displaying in the viewport that we have multiple attributes present in our source. That is good. And now up here we have this scale over duration option, and you should always enable this. What that will do, to explain this, I'm going to just remove out all of these fields. I'm just going to create an intensity attribute, and let's enable the scale over duration. And what that will do, it will use this ramp to fade out your attribute. And if I were to play this, and here as you can see, our color is changing. This color represents the fading. I'm going to just bring this ramp a bit closer to make fade these attribute a bit faster. And if I were to hit play, and here as you can see, after few frames we have white, and we are fading out to gray, and then we will change this. We are changing our color to completely black, which means that we have values of 0. And what that will do, it will create a fading volume. And if I were to create a volume rasterize attribute, let's add a volume rasterize attribute to rasterize our this density attribute into volume. Let's go in here, and I'm going to just select my density attribute. And here you can see we have the volume, and right now it starts as a very thick volume. And as if I were to scrub my play bar, and here as you can see, we will see some fading effect. And at the number 11, if I were to view the Pyro source, and here as you can see, we have this black color. We still have particles in our source, but our density attribute is 0. And in here, thus we are not getting our volume. And when we have this value gray, value, we will getting this less density value, which means we are creating a very thin volume. Maybe it should be easier if I were to lower down my voxel size. Let's change this to even lower, 0.02. And in here onto the Pyro burst source, if I were to play around with the ramp, and here as you can see, it's controlling the fading. So which means we are using this ramp to fade out our source. And if I were to uncheck this option, what that means, that we are starting as solid, and at the end frame our source it's just gone. Let's enable the scale over duration, and that will create this natural fading effect. And let me default out this ramp, play around with this ramp, and that is the scale over duration. And I can also enable the scale along trailing. What that will do, it will fade out its edges. Let's enable this, and here as you can see, we are fading out these edges. I can play around with the ramp, and these are the outer boundaries. We are fading them out. So maybe let's always enable both of them so that we have fading edges and fading out of our source. That is a very natural looking source. And onto the output attribute, we have some of the option to output our velocity attribute, and right now velocity is enabled, which means that if I were to middle mouse button, not on the volume rasterize but onto the Pyro burst source, if I were to middle mouse button And here as you can see, we have the V mean the velocity. And we can also visualize our velocity if you come over here where it says display normal, and down here we have the display point trail. Point trail will visualize our velocity. So let's click on it, and here as you can see we have some velocity information. Let me disable this, and let's delete this volume rasterize attribute. And in here we have, at the Pyro burst source, we have some presets. For example, if we want to convert all of our these, let me go into the burst component, and because we are enabling this ramp, we need to scroll this down. Here we have the attributes, and right now we are creating an one attribute density. And if I were to add another attribute, let me enable the create source. I'm going to change this to burn. And now if we were to convert these attributes into volume, we need to add a volume rasterize attribute node and select all of these attributes in here to convert them into volume. Or into the Pyro burst source, if I go up, in here we have this quick setup. If I were to click on it, and in here we have this option to create source volume. If I click on it, what that will do, it will create a volume rasterize attribute, and it will add all of these attributes for you that you are creating. And it is using the expression to bring out your attributes, which mean I can interactively go into my Pyro burst source, and in here I can add more attributes. Let's say I can say create source, and in here I'm going to add another attribute, and now this attribute is going to be added also. And now here as you can see, we are creating these 4 volumes. We are also creating our velocity volume as well to add our initial velocity. And that is why we have this weird viewport visualization. This weird viewport visualization always come when you have vector volume visualized. V is a vector, and that is why we have this visualization. I can go into the Pyro burst source at top. Let's go into the output attribute. I'm going to just disable the velocity, and right now, and here you can see velocity has been disabled, and our viewport is displaying our density accurately because right now we do not have any vector volume. And same thing, I can go into the component, I can remove these attributes, and they will going to be removed in here as well. And let me remove this, and onto the Pyro burst source we can go into this quick setup. I can directly create my Pyro simulation from here if I were to click on this Pyro simulation. And what that will do, it will add the volume rasterize attribute and fill all of the attributes in here, and also create a Pyro solver and import all of our sources into this Pyro solver as well. And remember that these sources are not interactive, which means if you were to go into the burst component and add another component, let's say I want to add divergence, it will not going to be added interactively because in here we are not using any of the expression to procedurally import. So which means you need to always add another source by clicking on this plus button if you want to manually add, but it will going to be convert them into volume automatically by using these volume rasterize attributes, but you also need to import them Pyro solver manually. So in the next lesson, let's see how we can use the Pyro burst source to create our explosion.